good afternoon. Welcome back again to the Modern Challenges to the Extraterrestrial Hypothesis Conference. Thanks for joining us for the 70th anniversary of Roswell, New Mexico's famous Roswell incident, where we are looking at alternative explanations other than aliens to describe the activities of what the world believes are UFOs, aliens, and the Roswell incident itself. Nick Redfern has already smoked us with a presentation on the man-made view of Roswell incident. Many of you were here for that. Hello, South Africa joining us on the web. Love having y'all here, both in person and online. Now, one of the interesting features about this event is, we're challenging the extraterrestrial hypothesis. One of my talks was on aliens and demons. We've got a PhD theologian also involved with the conference here, Dr. Mike Heiser. Joe Jordan's talked on alien abduction stopped in Jesus' name. And that's a real powerful lecture in itself. So there's the conversation came up last night. What's the mix here and how do people think about that? Well, we have an event that is 3 Christian and 3 non, so it's not all religious views. But what's unique about the talk Nick is delivering right now is that based on the book he wrote, Final Events, is that you have someone who does not identify himself as a religious person in any way, presenting government files that argue for a demonic interpretation of UFOs. So scratch your head on that one. And Nick has done it before publicly. It's a controversial book in the UFO realm, but Nick is absolutely no stranger to controversy. He's no stranger to Roswell. He's not quite been run out of town by anyone else here yet. And I hope you feel the same, and welcome up Nick Redfern one more time today.
Thanks everybody. I'm kind of getting deja vu. But this lecture is completely different to the Roswell one this morning. And is anybody who's new who wasn't on the first lecture this morning? Okay, not many of you. Well, just sort of a brief background. Despite what some people have said, I am a full-on believer in the UFO subject. The reason I got involved and interested is my father was in the British Royal Air Force. He was a radar mechanic, and he was involved in several UFO incidents. This was back in the 1950s, and he kept quiet about this until I was probably 10, 11, 12, something like that, and he told me the story about how on several occasions he'd been involved in the tracking and analysis of radar tapes in relation to these unidentified objects, which were performing all sorts of weird manoeuvres over the English Channel and the North Sea, which sort of borders the main part of Europe. And not just because it was my own dad, but also because he was trained in the military as a radar mechanic. When he told me this, it sort of really got me interested and opened my eyes to the idea that, wow, UFOs, it's not just sort of sci-fi stories, etc. So I began looking into the subject further and reading books and things like that, and then started researching the subject and took it from there. So I am a believer. I don't like to use terms like belief because, where possible, I try and go with facts, evidence, etc. But in many cases, hard evidence and irrefutable facts are sort of not that common in many UFO cases. So in many cases, we are forced to speculate or come to belief systems. And in varying degrees, we all have belief systems. That's what makes us human. So I am a full-on believer in the UFO subject, but I think we shouldn't be labelling the UFO subject just under one banner. When we talk about, somebody's a UFO researcher, particularly within the general public, there's this mindset, if you're a UFO researcher, you're chasing UFOs, you're chasing aliens, specifically extraterrestrials, and which of course isn't the case. And over the years, certainly, there have been multiple explanations for what UFOs might be and what the origin of the phenomenon or phenomena might be. Everything from aliens, time travelers, supernatural, paranormal, demonic, occult, government experiments using radical aircraft that might be perceived as UFOs. And so in other words, the term UFO or UFO phenomenon is really a catch-all term for multiple unexplained events which could have varying degrees of explanations that may actually not be in any way connected with another UFO case. So I think that is one of the dangers, if you like, is assuming that everything falls under one particular banner when it really doesn't. And that sort of brings us to the thing I'm going to talk about today, which in many respects is probably more controversial than the Roswell story, but from a very different perspective. This one, it does actually deal with Roswell towards the end of the lecture, but it's in many respects moves us in avenues and directions that are far removed from anything to do with extraterrestrials, crashed UFOs, aliens, dead or alive, Area 51, things like this. It takes us down a very kind of disturbing avenue, and again, much of it, I guess the impact it'll have on you is dependent upon your belief in religion, life after death, faith, that kind of thing. And I'm certainly not an atheist. I can't say I'm a full unbeliever. I'm like a lot of people. I don't know what happens when we die, and I don't have a firm belief systems to, what an afterlife realm might be, or even if there is one, I don't know. I have had a couple of weird experiences that lead me to believe we don't kind of wink out when we die. I do think there's something, because I think most people, when somebody dies, most people have a weird story to tell. Something strange happened when somebody in their life died, like a weird synchronicity or a strange event occurred. For example, I know when my grandmother died, and my mother, like a week later, got a sudden overwhelming odour of my grandmother's perfume in her house when they were cleaning it out. Does it prove anything? No, but it's interesting. And a lot of people do get strange experiences like that, or they'll have a dream just after the person's died, and it doesn't seem like a normal dream. Now, somebody might say that's the unconscious part of your brain kind of trying to make things easier for you to cope with, but then again, maybe it's not. So, in other words, I'm not somebody who dismisses the things I'm going to talk about, but I am talking about it from sort of a detached perspective. Again, kind of like with the Roswell lecture, what I'm going to do is talk about the particular subject, share the information with you that I uncovered, and then, hopefully we can kind of figure out what people think about it, do they feel it's valid, and how should we deal with it. So, again, I don't feel the responsible approach for me is to endorse it and tell you that I think it's 100% true, or to deny it. I truthfully don't know, where the truth lies. All I can do, as I said, is present what we've uncovered. Now, the story is a very strange one. It deals with what we would call like a think tank type organisation within the government that has clandestinely looked into the UFO subject and has come away from that subject, looking at the topic and concluding that what we're dealing with is not extraterrestrial or time travellers for the most part, or man-made craft. They take the view that we're dealing with something that is literally kind of demonic, supernatural, occult, however you want to term it. And they view it as a very dangerous, deceptive phenomenon, and arguably a phenomenon that should be kept away from at all costs. Now, of course, a lot of people who take the view that we're dealing with nuts and bolts aliens would outright dismiss that particular scenario. But again, regardless of which side of the coin you're on, it is a fact that a lot of weird stuff does happen in relation to UFO sightings. It's not always just people have an encounter with some sort of strange object they see in the sky. There are a lot of issues and reports that do seem to have sort of supernatural overtones to UFO encounters, for example. And I'll expand on this later. There are various alien abduction stories where people claim that their soul was separated from the body when they were abducted. You have people having weird synchronicities, people falling down with ill health as if they've been sort of supernaturally infected by the presence of an entity in the bedroom, that kind of thing. So, in other words, the phenomenon may not be all that it seems to be, depending on how you interpret the data and the extent and depth of your belief systems, as I said, in relation to religion, faith, and things like that. Now, as very often when I'm investigating things of a UFO nature, it's not always sort of cut and dry and black and white as to how the story surfaces. But it all basically revolves around a story that I tell in this book, which came out in 2010, Final Events. And it tells the story of a man who I spoke with in 2007, named Ray Beauchet, and that's Ray there. Now, Ray has an interesting background. He's an Anglican priest, but he's also a former state director for MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network. And Ray lives in, Ray lives in Lincoln, Nebraska. And back in the 1980s, I said he was a state director for Nebraska. And he's someone who's, I guess, got like a unique background, both in the church, but also deeply involved in ufology. And back in the 1980s, he was heavily investigating one of the UK's most famous UFO cases, an event which occurred at Rendlesham Forest in the county of Suffolk, England, in December 1980. And for people who don't know the story, across December 26th through the 28th of December 1980, there were claims and reports of multiple UFO activity in the nearby Rendlesham Forest, where people saw these strange lights in the sky. There were reports of lights beaming down to the weapons storage area, of a strange triangular-shaped object in the woods, and reports of, sort of a classic cover-up, you won't talk about this, etc., etc. And so the Rendlesham case was one of the more intriguing ones. And in the mid-2000s, I was thinking about writing a book on this particular subject. And I contacted Ray because he had briefly mentioned in a book published by Jenny Randalls called From Out of the Blue, Ray was quoted in there as saying that he felt or suspected that there was some sort of secret experiment to the Rendlesham event, in the sense that it wasn't a UFO that came down or something paranormal, but it was a military experiment. And I found this interesting. So when I was planning, at least, on doing a Rendlesham book, which I never actually got around to doing, I phoned Ray up and said, "Hey Ray, I'm thinking about doing a book on Rendlesham, and I kind of find this interesting, what you have to say about it being a test of some sort of technology, a secret experiment rather than a UFO event." And Ray said, "Well, yeah, that's exactly what the people I spoke to told me." So then it was a case of, well, who are these guys? And he said, "Well, before I get to the guys, let me tell you what they told me." And these were a pair of Department of Defense physicists. And they had told Ray aspects of the Rendlesham story. Now, the reason why it seems that he may have been approached was several reasons. Also in the 1980s, Ray was heavily using the Freedom of Information Act and congressman, senator, to try and open the doors on the files, any files that might exist on Rendlesham. And he was knocking on various arms of governments, etc. So that might have brought him to somebody's attention on the inside, so to speak. So from there, Ray then was approached by these two physicists from the Department of Defense who said, well, yes, something did happen at Rendlesham, but no, it didn't involve aliens, nothing came down from another world or anything like that at all. And Ray was told that it involved the usage of highly sophisticated hologram type technology. Now, for people who don't know, holograms, essentially, today's holograms are really sophisticated. The idea you can project an image, like almost like a 3D image of a person or a box or anything, but it's not really there, it's a projection. And Ray was told that, in essence, the military was testing, or the higher-ups of the military were testing this technology out RAF Bentwaters, Royal Air Force Bentwaters in the UK, essentially to gauge the effects and the conclusions of the airmen as to what they were seeing. In other words, if these holograms could be so sophisticatedly put together so sophisticatedly, what would it mean if you could, in essence, convince the military that they were seeing aliens and flying saucers? If you could convince them of that, you could convince them of anything. So, in other words, it was allegedly a testing of highly advanced military technology which might one day be needed on the battlefield. You know, if, God forbid it happened, we went to war, you know, with Russia or somebody, is it possible that we could fool the enemy into seeing something that actually isn't really there? And could that have an effect on them in terms of, should we attack or shouldn't we? What is it we're dealing with? So that was the basic theme of the story, but it went sort of a step further. And Ray was told in a way that is still unclear to him to this day, that there was something else, something stranger with regard to this hologram technology. Namely, that supposedly it wasn't just like a projection. Reportedly, in some strange way, it could impact on its environment. So in other words, if you had a projection of, say, a 3D flying saucer with 3 legs, like a tripod format of legs, when the object was seen to land, it would actually leave depressions in the ground. Even though it wasn't a solid vehicle, it was more that some sort of energy was being directed to actually create the indents in the soil as well. Now, of course, Ray found this very fascinating, but he was also deeply sceptical of it as well, to his credit. And he did wonder if this was disinformation, trying to steer him away from what may have really happened at Roswell, if that wasn't really what happened. So, in other words, it was a very sort of cloak and dagger type situation where he didn't know what to think. But, you know, Ray is an Anglican priest, and, you know, I believe his story as he told it. You know, I fully believe his story as he related it to me. And he had his suspicions that possibly he was approached because he had spent so much time in the 80s looking into Rendlesham. But of course, it's like whenever you get sort of somebody in the inside or a whistleblower, you know, many people in ufology are quite quick to embrace these stories because they very often sound exciting. What I try and do is, if people like that approach me, I ask the question of myself, what's going on in what I'm doing right now, or what would be somebody's motivation in coming forward and sharing a secret like this? You know, a lot of people just embrace the secret because it sounds cool, it's exciting, etc., etc. But what is the motivation? That's one of the most important things that we should be looking at, and a lot of people often forget. I mean, just recently, excuse me, just recently a number of documents, controversial documents, surfaced from an alleged group within the government said to investigate UFOs and known as MJ-12 or Majestic 12. And there's a big debate on the recent surfacing of the latest batch. We can talk about Roswell, dead aliens, alien autopsies. And I went through them, and they're not real, they're not. It's somebody's idea of a joke, almost certainly. And if it's not a joke, if it's disinformation, it's really bad and not very well done disinformation. But a lot of people embraced them and bought into them because the documentation's exciting. You know, it tells an interesting story. But, you know, you have to be sort of detached if you can when you're looking into these things. And that's what Ray did. Now, what happened from there is when he spoke to me and told me this story about Rendlesham Forest, and I said, well, that'd be an interesting part of the story to put into the book that actually never was. And he said words to the effect of, well, that's only a minute part of the story. And I said, what do you mean? The rest's another part of Rendlesham? He said, no. He said, that's all they told me about Rendlesham, that it revolved around some sort of sophisticated hologram technology. And as an aside, he said that the reason why the experiments went on in the UK is because of this issue. There's like within the military, there's certain regulations about what can be done in terms of In terms of like human rights, there's certain things that cannot be done on US soil, laws and legislation. But outside of the US, they can be undertaken. And Ray noted this, the fact that the experiments occurred on British soil. It also occurred over the Christmas holiday, which may be significant because Rendlesham Forest, as I said, is surrounded by RAF Bentwaters and RAF Woodbridge, 2 military bases. Even though the bases don't obviously shut down at Christmas, unless there's like a high state of alert, the bases do go on like a skeleton staff. So moving the experiment to the UK, running it at Christmas when there's a skeleton staff late at night, that might have afforded the team the perfect time, location, and everything else to conduct this experiment without being pretty much found out, in terms of what was actually going on. So from there, Ray said, well, do you want to excuse me, hear the rest of the story? And I said, well, yeah, sure, what is the rest of the story? And he said that what happened was they initially contacted him by phone and had a very brief meeting, and then a much longer meeting in November 1991 at a place called the Cornhusker Hotel in Lincoln, Nebraska. And this was a lengthy meeting that took up most of the day. And he said they identified themselves and provided credentials as physicists, that they were working in the DoD, and they were working on this clandestine secret program to contact what they called NHEs, or non-human entities. Now, we're not talking about, from their perspective at least, aliens or extraterrestrials. They use the term non-human entities to define something that was non-human, but they weren't sure entirely what it was. And they wanted Ray's help and assistance because of his sort of unique background as a priest, but also as a long-standing UFO researcher and a state director of MUFON. And so what we did, I spoke to Ray and said, well, can we do a lengthy, much longer interview? And he said, yeah, sure. And I think altogether I spoke to him, these were all recorded interviews. It was over like a week, and I think we did about 3 or 4 hours a day for like a week almost. It was a massive series of interviews, much of which actually doesn't appear in the book because, the book would have been this thick, So I sort of relied and related in terms of the primary data which I felt was relevant to the story. But Ray told me about how on this first occasion at the meeting, it was very, very brief, and they talked about Rendlesham, and that was about it. But at the Cornhusker interview in November 1991, this is where the story came tumbling out. And it basically revolved around this unusual group, which I won't call an agency. It wasn't like the CIA or the NSA, it wasn't a government agency. It was like a very flexible, loose-knit think tank that would periodically get together to look at the weirder aspects of the UFO phenomenon. Now, if we look back at the history of the UFO phenomenon in terms of what the US government knows or doesn't know about the subject, we do find that government agencies have taken different approaches to what is at the heart of the UFO phenomenon. For example, Project Sign, Project Grudge, which are the 2 earliest programs, at one point the files show they suspected that the extraterrestrial angle could well be the correct one. Project Blue Book, which followed on and then closed down in 1969, by the end they pretty much washed their hands of it and didn't want anything else to do with it. But in 1949, there was another little project set up by the government's Weather Bureau to look into the idea of ball lightning being behind UFOs. Ball lightning is sort of a very rare phenomenon where you have lightning, but instead of like a sheet or a crash of lightning, it manifests in the form of like a sphere, like a ball. It's very, very, very rare, but it's known as ball lightning. And there's the Robertson panel, which the CIA created in the early 50s. That was less concerned with the issue of what UFOs were, but how psychologically the subject can be used as a tool of manipulation, as a means to sort of affect and influence human perception on the subject, etc. So in other words, we know that there have been a lot of different programs looking at the UFO subjects. And this particular program was looking at the idea that these things that we call aliens or the greys was something supernatural, something paranormal. And as Ray concluded, and how this group concluded, it was quite literally demonic. Now, as I said, I'm not a full believer, I'm not an atheist, I'm like a lot of people, I don't know what the truth is. Again, all I can do is tell you what Ray told me and what he uncovered. Now, this group apparently did actually begin as sort of a think tank that was looking at the UFO subject impartially, but actually with a view to figuring out if it was actually extraterrestrial. And as I said, they had this think tank type organisation that would investigate various aspects of the UFO phenomenon to try and figure out what was going on. But they told Ray that the more and more that they dug into this subject, the further and further they felt they were dealing with something that was not extraterrestrial, but that was masquerading as extraterrestrial and essentially giving the group what they wanted. Now, it's important to note that Ray said the physicist told him that they actually had contact with these beings. Now, we're not talking about aliens landing, you know, outside the White House or anything like that. We're not even talking about face-to-face contact. We're talking about people on the project essentially getting themselves into altered states of mind, hypnosis, and there are even stories, you know, that they'd use things, mind-altering technologies and substances to alter their mindset, which might allow them to sort of interact with these entities. And so the story went, they actually succeeded in contacting them. And this is where it gets into extremely controversial areas. The idea was they realised that these NHEs possessed incredible powers, and they wanted to try and harness the powers of the NHEs and weaponise them. In other words, in sort of bizarre and bleak terms, they wanted to do a deal with demons to essentially weaponise their supernatural powers, which kind of sounds like the most bizarre kind of sci-fi you could imagine. But it was coming from Pentagon's physicists who related the story to Ray. And as I said, although, you know, I'm on the fence as to what all this means, but, you know, I fully trust Ray. I don't, you know, Ray's a highly trustworthy priest. What he said, I accept, no pun intended, as gospel, you know, it is. And so you had this program which essentially was working to do sort of a deal with demons, if you accept the scenario. Whether or not that's the case, I don't know. But the story went from there that the further and further they dug into this, the more and more that the people on the program found themselves in sort of a very disturbing situation, to the point where it was almost like a black cloud or a curse had fallen over the project, to the point where people reportedly died, some fell sick. For others, it was like every day was like, you know, your worst Monday morning multiplied 10 times over. And it was as if, it literally was as if some sort of dark curse had fallen on them. And they wanted Ray's advice and possibly even help in trying to figure out how to get away from whatever this thing was that had got its grips into them. It was as if they'd opened a door or a portal, which, you know, in paranormal realms is pretty easy to do. Closing the door and sending back the thing that came through is allegedly not so easy to do. And that was the position that this group found itself in. And as they expanded on what was going on, they talked about how they had people on board who were deciphering and translating for them, like 700-800-year-old old manuscripts on demonology and things like this, and witchcraft, and just trying to get a handle on what it was they were dealing with, because, as I said, that was not their first intention, was to sort of go down this demonic paranormal path. They were just looking into the UFO subject as a whole, and it was as time went on, actually quite quickly, that they then found themselves in this sort of situation of, you know, having done kind of what you would call like a Faustian pact, but it's really difficult to get out of. So what I'm going to do is give you, in essence, what we would call, well, basically, it's the word-for-word statement that Ray gave me in the initial interview, which will give you background on how and under what circumstances they contacted him and what his thoughts were about this whole situation. And this is Ray's exact words. I found it interesting because they had contacted me at work and I have no idea how they tracked me down there, the two physicists he's talking about. But they wanted to know if we could get together and have lunch to discuss something important. I met them for a brief time at the first meeting, and then they said, we'd like to get together and have a longer conversation. I arranged a time, it was quite a lengthy discussion, probably 3.5 hours, and that's how it all came about. And as I said, that's at this restaurant, hotel at the Cornhusker Hotel. Excuse me. After both meetings, when I was able to verify that the men held the degrees they claimed to hold and were apparently who they claimed to be, DoD physicists, I was intrigued and excited at the possibility of having stumbled on a more or less untouched area which could be researched. But I was also cautious in terms of why me. I had no way of knowing before our face-to-face meeting if there was any legitimacy to this at all. I wasn't given any information at all before our meeting, just the indication that they were involved in areas of research I would find interesting, and that they had some concerns they wished to discuss with me. I guess they were probably in their early to mid-50s, and they were in a real moral dilemma. Both of them are Christians and were working on a Department of Defence project that involved trying to contact the NHEs. In fact, this was described to me as an obsessive effort. And just before I carry on with the quote, the obsessive effort angle was apparently driven by the fact that the group believed that some sort of Armageddon, end of the world scenario was and still is on the horizon. So the obsessive effort angle of it all was to try and find a way to hold off whatever this significant event was going to be, and to continue. And part of this effort was to try and control the NHEs and use their powers in military applications and in intelligence areas such as remote viewing and psychotronic weapons. Now, the government has a long history of doing research into paranormal phenomena, supernatural powers, ESP, and much of this culminated in the government's remote viewing programs of the 70s and 80s, which essentially was training people to use their mind to spy on the enemy. In other words, instead of sending like an agent out to the Russian embassy in America and trying to figure out what's going on there, or putting listening devices like bugs in the embassy, what if we can project our mind and actually see what's going on there and pick it up psychically? So there is a long history of this going on. So this appears to be, if you like, the next step of it, sort of going beyond remote viewing and using the powers and skills of these NHEs and trying to understand their powers and could we replicate them in some way. They came to believe, said Ray, that the NHEs were not extraterrestrial at all. They believed they were some sort of demonic entities, and that regardless of how benevolent or beneficial any of the contact they had with these entities seemed to be, it always ended up being tainted, for lack of a better term, with something they ultimately turned out to be bad. There was ultimately nothing positive from the interaction with the NHE entities. They felt it really fell more under the category of some vast spiritual deception instead of UFOs and aliens. In the course of the whole discussion, it was clear that they really viewed this as having a demonic origin, that was there to simply to try and confuse the issues in terms of who they were, what they wanted, and what the source of the ultimate truth is. If you extrapolate from their take that these are demons in the biblical sense of the word, then what they would be doing here is trying to create a spiritual deception to fool as many people as possible. Now, on that same path, when they got to that point in the conversation, Ray realised why they're having so many problems. And the reason was that the group apparently wasn't making much, not much in terms of an advance or in terms of understanding what was going on. they were sure these things existed. They'd had some sort of mind-to-mind conversation, if you like, or contact as they saw it. But they needed to get back to the next step. The next step being, how do we actually directly interact with them? And according to what Ray was told, some people on the group essentially perform rites and rituals to try and invoke these things to come through. And that was the actual words Ray used, as I'll explain now. Again, back to Ray's words. From what they told me, it seemed like someone had invoked something and it opened a doorway to let these things in. That's certainly the impression they gave me. I was never able to get an exact point of origin of these sorts of experiments or of their involvement and when they got started. But I did get the impression that because of what they knew and the information they had presented, they had been involved for at least several years, even if the project had gone on for much longer. And there are indications it actually, in some degree, went back decades, but again, it was a very flexible, loose-knit group. It wasn't, like I said, an agency like the NSA. It was quite small, maybe at any given time, 20, 25 people with like-minded theories and ideas. They were concerned that they had undertaken this initially with the best of intentions, but then as things developed, they saw a very negative side to it that wasn't apparent earlier. So that's what leads me to think they had a relatively lengthy involvement. Now, most of it, Ray said, relates to what's called psychotronic weaponry, which very often falls into the category of what are known as non-lethal weapons. Very alternative, unusual weapons, like, for example, what are known as acoustic weapons. The human body, nervous system, is actually quite susceptible to low frequencies and can actually sort of mess with your mind and your nervous system as well. Acoustic weapons can provoke things like nausea, dizziness, vertigo, a sense of sickness, and can really disable a person when they're targeted properly. So a lot of these psychotronic, non-lethal weapons are very, very much out of the box, so to speak. Ray continued, most of it was related to psychotronic weaponry and remote viewing, and even deaths by what was supposed to be psychic methods. The project personnel were allowed to assume they had somehow technologically mastered the ability to do what the NHEs could do, remote viewing and psychotronics, but in actuality, it was these entities doing it all the time, or allowing it to happen for purposes that suited their deception. With both psychotronic weapons and remote viewing, I was told that the DoD had not really mastered the technology to do that at all. They were allowed by the NHEs to think that this is what they had done, but the NHEs themselves were always the causal factor. So in other words, it was deception from the beginning. Now on this issue of deaths, I asked Ray what he meant by this, what the guys had told him. And he told me, they showed me a dozen photographs of 3 different people, 4 photos of each person who had apparently been killed by these experiments being attempts to try and contact the NHEs. They were all post-mortem photographs taken in situ after the experiments. The areas shown in all of the photographs were like a dentist's chair or a barber's chair, and the bodies were still in those positions, sitting in the chairs, still there with EEG and EKG leads coming off of them. They were all wired. It was a very clinical setting, and there was no indication of who they were. It was a very disturbing sort of thing. And I'm thinking in the back of my mind, if these are real, who would have gotten these, who would they have gotten for these experiments? Were they volunteers? Were they some sort of prisoners? I have no idea. Were they American? Were they foreign? There was no way to tell. Now, what Ray did tell me was that they related to him data on the autopsies of the 3 people who had been killed. One of them was killed under undetermined circumstances, they could not figure it out. One had suffered a massive coronary, but the most bizarre deaths of all, one of these people sitting in the barber's chair supposedly, was like a huge dent in the side of the guy's head. It was just as if somebody had, almost like a crater, had been sort of slammed in on the inside. But clearly there was no physical aspect to it. It was just as if somehow the head had been just slammed and dented. And that was sort of one of the weirder and creepy aspects of the story. These photographs they brought along with them to the meeting, and Ray was in no doubt that this was real. He did not feel these were sort of staged photographs or anything like that, which I guess is not impossible. But if they weren't real, you know, a hell of a lot of work had gone into creating these photographs and ensuring, you know, they got these dentist-type chairs where the people were sat. So, again, whichever side of the coin you're on, it was either, you know, literal photographs of people who had died in the program, or somebody was spinning a line and a story for, you know, obscure reasons that maybe we still don't know today. Now, in terms of Ray's impressions on all this, he said, they had read some of my stuff, and they knew that I'd become a pastor, and that I had a Christian viewpoint from which I could examine these things. And they were concerned morally and ethically that they had allowed themselves to be duped into doing this research, and it had taken such a turn. My concern was also that, why come to me? Who am I? I can't do anything for you. I'm happy to evaluate it as best as I can, but if you have this concern, why not go to a Christian leader with a lot more clout and public visibility than I've got? But that was their reason. They were aware of the research I had done on a lot of things, but I could approach it from a Christian viewpoint, and that it was more of a moral dilemma for them. They wanted the information out there, but to me I have to think, is any of this accurate? On one hand, is this a way to throw disinformation out? But on the other hand, I think that even if they wanted to just spread disinformation, they could have done it with someone a lot more influential than me. I've been involved in this since 1965, and this is the most bizarre stuff I've ever run across. I didn't know what to make of it then, and I don't know what to make of it now. So that's basically the summary of what they told Ray, and the data that he received and his views on all this. And when we sort of boil it down to what was going on, as I said, we're talking about a Pentagon-funded or government-funded group, partially within the Pentagon, but also partially working at various private and public labs and facilities around the country, where they would get together now and again and try and figure, you know, there are new insights we can make on this phenomenon. And Ray had several more contacts with these people, and then a few years later, the two same guys contacted Linda Howe. And I had some interaction, not with them, but with other people on the programme, after Ray told his story and gave me a few tips and leads, which I followed up on. And that sort of opened things up a little bit more to where I was able to speak with some of the people on the project as well. Now, everybody the group spoke to sort of clandestinely and briefly, and that's one of the interesting things, that after speaking with Ray, they cut themselves off with him pretty much completely. They spoke to Linda Howe, had a dialogue for a little while, and then it was like over. And that was the same with me. I wrote the book Final Events in 2010. Pretty much after the writing of the book and it was ready for publication, after that there was like a complete silence, and apart from a couple of contacts since then, I've had no more contact with them. So there is this pattern of them talking to people, building things up, and then suddenly pulling back. And I do sometimes wonder if, I mean, it could be true, it could be disinformation, or maybe it's just these people wanting to essentially test the water to see how people react to it, but they retreat into the shadows because they don't want, personally at least, to come forward just yet. Their reliance on people in ufology to put the story out. And I think probably what happens is that they kind of gauge the response. You know, if they can target a small group like ufology to see what the response to this theory is, they could potentially then expand that to the, you know, the overall population of the country, and they might react as well. But it's much easier to target a small group to begin with to try and to get your answers. But there were certain things that were integral to all the different stories told, whether me, whether Linda Howe, whether Ray Bochet, or a few other people as well. That's the Pentagon, where we know for at least for a while parts of this program. I say parts of the program because it seems, although it was a think tank, there were sort of sub-projects within sub-projects, different people working on different aspects of the phenomenon. Now, one of the things that the group said was that the whole issue of how and why the research began and how the phenomenon sort of kicked off big time in the 20th century revolved around this guy, Aleister Crowley. And Aleister Crowley was an infamous occultist who, I guess, really was at his peak in his work in sort of the latter part of the 19th century through the early decades of the 20th century. And he died in 1947. And Crowley was someone who was heavily into the occult, and particularly issues relative to trying to summon up supernatural entities of a definitively paranormal type. And one of the more, I guess, sensational events that he was involved in was something that ran from 1918 through 1919 called the Amalantra Working. And it was essentially a series of rituals and rites within definitively altered states with drugs, psychedelics, to essentially open his mind to allowing him to commune and contact with supernatural beings that we would not see in a regular environment. And according to Crowley, he conjured up this entity known as LAM, L-A-M. And bear in mind that this drawing that Crowley drew was decades before the whole UFO phenomenon kicked in. This is the drawing of the picture he said was known as LAM. Oh, excuse me, that's another one of Crowley in his outfits. But that's LAM. Now, if you look at the picture of LAM, it doesn't look, look dissimilar to a lot of the reports people talk about today's grey aliens. You've got like the large, round head, sort of bulbous head, thin eyes. We don't have a big difference, of course, with today's so-called alien greys, is they have the large black eyes. But here they're sort of slitted and penetrating. But you do have the similarities with the very thin nose, the thin line for the mouth, the pointed chin, and of course, if you look at the body compared to the head looks massively oversized. So you can make a good case that in many respects does resemble the so-called alien grey of ufology. Bear in mind though, that as I said, Crowley died in 47. That was done years before by Crowley, and the ritual itself was performed in 1918. So, in other words, this, ironically, for all their concerns, that this group had in the Pentagon, they were really doing exactly, in the early 90s, they were doing exactly what Crowley was doing back in 1918, 1919. In other words, getting themselves into altered states to try and summon through the NHEs in the same way Crowley was trying to channel LAM. Not a great deal had changed, except a lot more funding, and Crowley's abode was replaced by the Pentagon. So it was very much a similar situation. And Crowley himself, some researchers have suggested he may have somehow inadvertently perhaps opened a doorway that's kind of created the first openings, if you like, of a portal that may have resulted in the latter UFO wave beginning in 1947. And there actually is an interesting another connection between Crowley and 1947 as well, which I'll come to. Now, just as an aside, excuse me, before he was involved in LAM and trying to invoke him, etc., Crowley had a home on the shores of Loch Ness, Scotland, called Boleskine House, which burned down in 2015. And when he was living in Boleskine House, Crowley was performing again all sorts of weird rites and rituals, essentially again to try and up supernatural beings. And people have noticed that in the aftermath of Crowley's activities, there was a distinct rise in reports of sightings of the so-called Loch Ness monsters, the Nesses. And some people take the view that whatever these creatures are, they're supernatural rather than flesh and blood animals. So, in other words, Crowley himself may well have sort of instigated, whether deliberately or not, the weirdness that gets reported at Loch Ness. And Boleskine House, not unlike the situation with the guys in the Pentagon, where this sort of black cloud descended on them. Any visitors to Boleskine House reported on how as soon as they walk inside, they can just almost taste you know, the menace that was in the place. It was if, you know, you go somewhere, sometimes it's kind of like the situation, we all meet somebody who we've never met before, but when you meet them, you just get a bad vibe from them, you know, you just feel there's something wrong, but you don't know why. And people got that vibe at Boleskine House, the idea that it was somehow cursed. And who knows, maybe it was, because two further owners actually killed themselves. One, an English actor named George Sanders, killed himself in 1972. And in 1960, a high-ranking military officer who owned the house shot himself in the head and killed himself. So a lot of strange stuff surrounding just about everything Crowley ever did, whether at Loch Ness, at Boleskine House, and with Lamb as well. Now, one of Aleister Crowley's deepest followers, there was this man, Jack Parsons. And Jack Parsons was a famous, brilliant rocket scientist. And in the early 1930s, he was really at the forefront of this burgeoning, growing interest in rocketry. Now, up until that point, you know, the First World War, etc., you know, we were fighting with aircraft, tanks and troops. By the early 30s, certainly, it was seen that it wouldn't be long before rockets were going to start playing a major role in the, on the battlefield, so to speak, in warfare. And Jack Parsons recognised this, and he was actually one of the founders of NASA's, what today is the Jet Propulsion Lab in Pasadena, California. And, but he was also a deep follower of Aleister Crowley. And not only that, he had a top secret clearance in the 1940s with the Army, Navy and the Air Force to perform these rocket tests. So not unlike with the Pentagon group in the 1980s, 1990s, where you had scientists, physicists, DoD people all mixed together, you had exactly the same in the 1930s and 40s, where you had Jack Parsons, an occultist, having a top secret clearance with the military. So again, you know, we see these crossovers between the military, the intelligence community, and the occult. And it's kind of amusing, you know, that when you read the stories about Parsons, he would have these rocket tests, and you'd have all these military, high-ranking people in their uniforms stood there. And as the rockets were about to be launched, you would have Parsons performing rituals and making summoning of ancient gods and so on to ensure a safe flight of the rocket. And of course the military kind of took a dim view on all this, but they also recognised that he was a brilliant scientist. So they're in this kind of, you know, situation, well, do we employ the guy or don't we? And they did for many years. And you know, he continued on his work until 1952, when, like as very often happens, he had a violent death. He blew himself up in his lab in Pasadena and just about made it to the hospital before he died. And so that was the end of Jack Parsons. But, as I said, he was someone who was heavily influenced by, well, not just heavily influenced by Crowley, but actually ran one of his lodges, so to speak, in Pasadena. So, in other words, what seems like a strange military program that began in the 1990s actually goes way back to the earliest parts of the 20th century, and certainly with the Loch Ness stuff back into the 19th century. Now, both Aleister Crowley and Jack Parsons were the subject of government files. As far as Parsons is concerned, it's specifically an FBI file. His FBI file used to be online at the FBI's website, which is called The Vault. And The Vault's like a really cool, good website. If you go to vault.gov, you can download FBI files which are now declassified. They're all free on everything from UFOs to Frank Sinatra, Marilyn Monroe, numerous actors, gangsters like Bonnie and Clyde, and all sorts of different things. And they're some of the original FBI files, and you know, they tell a fascinating story. At one point, the Parsons file was actually on file at the FBI's website, but for reasons I don't know, they took it down. But if you go to a place like archive.org, you'll find it. And in fact, I think you can find the FBI files on several sites. And the file somewhere about this thick, it's about 200 or 300 pages long, and it talks all about, you know, the things that he would get up to in Pasadena, California, you know, trying to summon these entities up and following up on Crowley's work, etc. And it seems for the most part, the FBI files were not so, well, they were obviously concerned about, you know, his position, having a top secret clearance and working with Aleister Crowley. But the one thing they kept coming back to was that they would have agents kind of standing outside his house or on the edge of the street, kind of seeing who was coming and going. And they seemed obsessed by the fact that they kept seeing what they described as, quote, loose women coming back and forth from the property. But that was kind of like one of the, you kind of get those kind of, you know, quirky statements in a lot of these FBI files when you dig deep into them. But the FBI and the military, as time went on, and as they saw it, with Parsons getting more and more reckless, they eventually removed his top secret clearance, and he was denied, you know, any more entry into that particular world. But he was certainly someone who, you know, we can place into the same category as the people that Ray O'Shea talked about.
Hey Nick, after Jack Parsons was involved with the Ocean Cloning, wasn't he known as the father of rocket fuel, that he invented rocket fuel?
Yeah, Jack Parsons was involved in a lot of interesting stuff, not just rocketry itself, but new concepts for fuels. He was also someone who was thinking way ahead, you know, about going to, when we go to the moon. And in fact, his influence was so strong that he actually has a crater named after him on the surface of the moon. And on top of that, the Jet Propulsion Lab of NASA, which he essentially created or founded, every Halloween, the JPL staff now, they have like a little party to remember Parsons. They all dress up in like old style white lab coats, and they bring out these mannequins dressed as Parsons, these cohorts, and they have like this Halloween ritual, which again is kind of bizarre that you've got NASA taking part in this Halloween ritual and paying homage to Jack Parsons and his, not just his rocketry, but who he was. And but he was also good friends for a while with L. Ron Hubbard, who created the Church of Scientology. They had a big falling out over a girl, and that was the end of it. But they were close friends for a while and covered a lot of the same areas, sort of an interest in aliens and life in the universe and, you know, advanced technology and so forth. So again, he's sort of a major part in the story. And Ray O'Shea's physicists told him that as far as they were concerned, that Parsons and Crowley were the ones who started all this. So in other words, they had been digging deep into clearly files, books, documents. We know that this particular group had the uncensored Jack Parsons file, had a copy of that. The released one has various deletions before it was released through Freedom of Information Act, but they reportedly had a copy of the original. So you know, they clearly had the ability to open a few doors. That's Parsons at work, right there, getting ready for one of his launches. And as I said, you know, he was a fascinating guy, but also a very alternative guy. But you often find that the best people who can achieve things in the scientific world are very often the ones who do think outside the box. You know, the people who've got unusual ideas and concepts very often come up with something new and novel. Now, as I mentioned, the FBI's file on Jack Parsons is no longer on the FBI's website, but that's actually the front cover page. It has the file number at the bottom, so you can actually still find it online with no problem, even though it's no longer at the FBI's site. Now, one of the other areas that this particular group looked into was the space brother phenomenon of the 1950s. Did you have a question? Did you have a question? Oh, okay. In the 1950s, unlike today, people who claimed alien encounters didn't actually report sort of these little 3 to 4 foot tall guys, you know, with the big heads and the black eyes. they were encountering what were known as space brothers or space sisters. They were described as looking very human-like, but with heads of long blonde hair. And this is same for the guys as well. You know, their hair was down to the shoulders, which obviously wasn't typical in the 1950s. And people claimed that they felt compelled to go out to certain isolated desert locations for reasons they didn't understand. Many of them not even involved in the UFO subject. And when they went out to these locations wondering, what on earth am I doing here? Suddenly this UFO would come into view and land, and these long-haired space aliens would come out and they would share their views on how we needed to change our ways, how we need to disarm our nuclear weapons, or we're going to destroy ourselves, we need to look after the planet better, etc., etc. And one of the guys who fell into this category was a man named George Van Tassel. And out in the California desert near a town called Landers, he built this building called the Integratron. And as you can see, there's the door, so it's like a two-story building. And according to George Van Tassel, he built this structure on the sort of designs and the words of the aliens. And whether you believe that or not, it is sort of fascinating construction because, as I said, it's 2 stories, you know, it's very sturdy, you can walk around upstairs, 20, 30 people, but there's not like a single, it's not a single nail, screw, rivet, bolt or anything. Each individual part holds the thing together. And so it's brilliantly put together, you know, the fact that it still stands, it was there in the 50s. So, and the idea was supposedly it could rejuvenate the human body and slow the aging process down. And the group that Ray spoke with, they felt that the Space Brothers and the Space Sisters were also like a demonic deception, trying to steer people down a different path, if you like, away from, as they saw it, religion and towards an extraterrestrial religion, but one which was actually being manipulated by demons. That's how they viewed it. And another group that Ray's group was looking at was the Etheria Society, which has its headquarters in Los Angeles, and they were following a similar path as well. The idea that yes, people were being contacted by something out in the desert, but no, it wasn't extraterrestrial, and yes, it was dangerous. Now, we come to probably the most controversial aspect of what the group looked into was the Roswell case. Now, if you were here for the lecture this morning, you would know that my conclusions, for those who aren't here, was that Roswell was some sort of human experiment rather than the crash of an alien spacecraft. But the group itself that Ray spoke with, they had an even weirder and more unique theory on what happened at Roswell. They felt that it was quite literally some sort of a demonic deception. Now, the 2 things that everybody talks about primarily with Roswell, and that's again, for people who weren't here this morning, that's the actual crash site where the event occurred. From sort of here, and then fanning outwards for about 600 feet was where all this strange field of debris and wreckage was found. And that's the one thing everybody talks about, the other one being the bodies. Those are the 2 primary aspects. And the group Ray was with, or communicating with, focused on those 2 areas as a means to try and explain what they felt happened at Roswell. They believe that these NHEs, the non-human entities, could literally manipulate matter. In other words, they could manipulate matter, they could manipulate atoms, and essentially create things out of nothing. And they felt that the event itself was a staged event. In other words, that the crash, if you like, wasn't a crash at all. It was meant to look like a crash. They believed that these entities had weaved and created this strange foil, and then essentially it was scattered across the ground. And even believed that they had also created the bodies themselves, that they actually never lived. They were like flesh and blood mannequins created out of the manipulation of matter and atoms, and that the bodies were laid strewn out. And the group came to believe that this was done as a means for these entities to present themselves as vulnerable extraterrestrials, when in reality, as they saw it, they were deceptive demons, but they were trying to present themselves as something non-threatening, vulnerable, and something from outer space. And according to what Ray said, they had quite a chat about the whole Roswell angle and how they felt that even the government had been deceived by those, you know, the idea that the government still had these bodies, but didn't realise that they actually weren't bodies of things that had ever really lived, that it was kind of like what we would call a Trojan horse. If you know the old story of the Trojan horse, the idea of you create something that's meant to be a gift, but it's actually hiding inside it is something which is, you know, your deadly enemy. And that's how they viewed it, that the Roswell crash was a staged Trojan horse as a means to get its grips into our society today. Now, I find that kind of sort of fairly, I won't say outrageous, but I mean, it's something I think that, you know, needs certainly more investigating to kind of endorse that theory. But I will admit, you know, it's a fascinating alternative theory that hasn't really been touched upon. But what is interesting is on this aspect of, you know, the bodies supposedly having been like fabrications that never really had any kind of life. Jack Parsons was someone who undertook a number of experiments to try and create entities that never really lived. Things like, for example, a homunculus, which is the idea of creating a life form out of something that never really lived, but using sort of magical rituals and performances, etc. So, and there are even rumours that the very tiny blew himself up in his lab in Pasadena, that he was trying to create one of these artificial life forms. So, you know, it's interesting that when you look at that angle, and then you hear this group's views, that they also came to the conclusion of these artificial bodies that never actually were. So, in other words, they went right back from Aleister Crowley right through to Roswell. Now, in terms of the modern era, as I said, whatever this group was, or still actually is, and there's sort of some debate as to whether or not they're still existing or not. One of the interesting things that surfaced just after the book came out, and in one of the last conversations I had with these people, was that they had largely put most of the programs on hold, or the sub-projects were on hold, or terminated. And I asked why that was, and they said, well, they felt by now, well, by 2009, by 2010, they felt they'd got all the answers they needed. There was no need for them to investigate abductions anymore. There was no need for them to investigate close encounters or landings, because they felt they'd got all the material they needed, and they felt they'd made a case that this was a demonic deception. Now, on the abduction angle, this was one of the more latter-day things they got into, because when you think of alien abductions, most people think of, you know, somebody's taken on board a craft and they're subjected to medical experiments and cells are taken and DNA, etc. But in a lot of abduction stories, the witnesses report their, as they've described it, like their soul being extracted from their body. There are some cases where people said they've been taken on board a UFO, but in like an out-of-body experience, they weren't physically taken. In some cases, they could see themselves rising out of the body in the bed with these little grey things floating around them, and then being transported to the UFO. And the group came to believe that these entities, the NHEs, have the ability to literally steal and manipulate souls and recycle souls and all sorts of bizarre things that are a mixture of science and, I guess, what we would call magic, for want of a simpler term. So the abduction thing is one of the latter-day things. As I said, as far as I know, and I can't prove they weren't lying, but they said they pretty much shut all the programs down. But one of the more interesting things they did in their sort of latter-day research was to look into the mystery of the Men in Black. Now, if you know, you talk to people today about the Men in Black, most people think of the movies, you know, Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones. A lot of people don't realise that the movies were actually based on existing reports of Men in Black going back to the late 40s and early 50s. But the big difference between the Men in Black of reality and those of Hollywood is that the Hollywood versions, the Men in Black are like secret agents of some sort of clandestine government, clandestine agency within government. But if you speak to the vast majority of the Men in Black witnesses, and I've written 3 books on the subject and literally got hundreds and hundreds of stories, they don't describe these things as looking like, and I call them things for a reason, they don't look like they've come from the government. They're typically very skinny, very pale, often very tall, and they have these wraparound sunglasses which seem to hide large, bulging eyes. And in many respects, they actually don't look fully human. They kind of look, I guess, a cross between an alien, one of the Walking Dead. You know, they have this sort of weird way of walking and stilted language, and they come across, some people actually said, you know, they kind of look like a corpse dug up, which is very different from the imagery in the movies, because in the movies they wanted, you know, this sort of sci-fi angle. But with the real Men in Black case, it's very more sort of occult driven. And they look deeply into the work of a man named Albert Bender. Albert Bender was a guy who got involved in ufology in the late 40s and created a group called the International Flying Saucer Bureau. And he lived in Bridgeport, Connecticut. And his group really took off big time. He had contacts all around the world, and he created his own newsletter, which was selling, you know, in close to the thousands, you know, certainly the high hundreds. And over time, it grew and grew and grew, to the point where eventually it was sort of a major force within the early years of ufology. And from there, what happened was that one night, Bender was sitting on the bed in his attic. He lived in this sort of creepy-looking old house, which is kind of appropriate. And he, of all rooms possible, he rented the attic. And he changed it into what he called his Chamber of Horrors, and which might have explained why these things visited him, because he created this supernatural altar, as he called it. And he, like Crowley and like Parsons, he tried to invoke things through. And for him, it was kind of, you know, what you get is what you ask for, so to speak. And he said he was lying on the bed, or sitting on the bed, and he suddenly started to feel ill. He went lightheaded, dizzy. The room was filled with this odour of like rotten eggs. And he felt like he was going to pass out, you know, faint. So he lay down on the bed, and suddenly these 3 smoky, cloudy figures materialised through the wall. And then they became sort of full-bodied. They had like a black suit, black tie, skinny black tie, black fedora hat, and you know, they kind of looked like supernatural gangsters or something like that, you know, from some old 1950s black and white movie. And they essentially told him psychically, leave the UFO subject or else. And it was kind of the or else thing that eventually led Bender to leave ufology. But he found himself, like the guys at the Pentagon, falling sick. He had major stomach issues. There's some evidence that he started to have fits and things like this. And it was all in the wake of these visits from the Men in Black. And so a very kind of sinister and bizarre situation. And as I said, the group began looking deeply into Bender's work, trying to, I think at least, to figure out where he went wrong and where they maybe could have gone right. They didn't sort of completely follow his path. But what is interesting is that when you look into these Men in Black stories, you do find a lot of paranormal overtones. For example, you know, if you'd seen a UFO and somebody wanted to silence you about it, you know, you can imagine the Men in Black might come to your house, kick your door down, and slam you against the wall, and say, you know, you won't talk about this. That's actually not how the real Men in Black act. Typically, you know, they'll come out late at night. You know, if you get a knock on the door, say 11 p.m, you think, who on earth's that? You know, you look through the spy hole, and you see 3 creepy, skinny, pale guys in black suits and 1940s fedoras. You're probably not going to let the door open the door. You'll probably maybe even phone the police. But the weird thing is that people don't do that. They actually do open the door. Most of the witnesses have said it's almost like their mind has been controlled or compelled in some sort of altered state to let them in. And the Men in Black won't come into people's homes until they're invited to come in, which kind of ties in, you know, with the with the legends of vampires. You know, if you look at the old stories of vampires, you know, I'm not sort of supporting the idea that they literally are literal vampires, but if you look into the old legends, you know, they would be dressed in black, they'd come out at night, they look pale, and they had to be invited into your home before they could come in. So I sometimes wonder if old legends of vampires could actually be old encounters with men in black, because the actions that they perform today are very much like that, where they will not come in for the most part unless they're invited in. So, you know, you have that parallel. You have the issue, again, of people falling sick in close proximity to the men in black. There are people who reported violent poltergeist activity in the home after the men in black have left. So you put all these issues together, you can make a case that there is a supernatural aspect to the men in black mystery.
With black-eyed children is also part of that men in black?
Yeah, there's a lot of phenomena that's connected. You have the men in black, there is lesser known women in black stories, which are just the same, where they're really pale looking, and very often, you know, the women also wear these wraparound sunglasses, because when people are being close to them, they've seen that their eyes look, you know, much larger than they should be. And you also have what's called the shadow people. The shadow people, as the name suggests, they're like a silhouetted shadow but wearing a black fedora, so they do look like men in black. Then within the shadow people group, you have these sub-projects like the Hat Man. The Hat Man's kind of a similar thing. And even some of you may have heard of the Slender Man. The Slender Man story is one which actually began on the internet in 2009. It's basically like an internet project to create who can come up with the creepiest character. And certainly the creepiest one that was created was the Slender Man, which is, again, looks like the Men in Black. He wears a black suit, a skinny black tie, white shirt, but he's not very tall, 7 or 8 feet tall, and his arms and legs are spindly, like spidery, almost like an insect, and targets children and attacks them and kidnaps them, kills them. That's the story in the tales that have been created about the Slender Man. But what's happened is that there's such a fascination for the Slender Man mystery now, all around the world, with literally, you know, millions of people. And if you Google Slender Man and you look at the number of hits, I mean, it's in the millions. And people are now seeing the Slender Man in the real world. And this kind of ties in, if any of you saw Greg Bishop's lecture about the various angles for what might be behind the UFO phenomenon, one of the things Greg talked about was the issue of tulpas, or thought forms. And the idea is, the human mind, if you concentrate on something so deeply that actually doesn't exist, you can create a real-world version of it. In other words, so many people are fascinated by the Slender Man, which is like the Men in Black. So many people are fascinated by him, particularly kids, teenagers. They become obsessed, they're thinking about it all the time. When you have this group consciousness all coming together, even if they don't realise they're coming together, they potentially can create an external version of the Slender Man, which was created in fiction, we know that. But the idea is you could create a real life version just by intensely believing in it and wanting it to come to life. And this is like a Buddhist Tibetan term and belief system, the idea that the human mind, when it focuses on, you know, you can focus on anything, and eventually, with enough strength of mind and psychic power, psychic phenomena, you could actually instill this thing and create it, and it would have an independent existence. And because the existence is independent, that might explain why things like the Men in Black, the Black-Eyed Children, the Slender Man, they may all be strengthened by the fact that people have started to believe in them, or do believe in them. And the group also was looking into this angle, the idea that some of these entities they believe were demonic, but others were born out of the fact that people were, you know, certainly were attracted to demonic phenomena, believing in it and creating their own equivalents of demonic things. So, in other words, the things that the group were looking at were very, very sort of crossover things, which weren't just linked with UFOs. I mean, when you brought up just now the Black-Eyed Children, there are a lot of parallels between the black-eyed kids and the Men in Black, where they're called the black-eyed kids because they have these weird black eyes. They typically wear black hoodies, you know, with the hood pulled down. They knock on people's doors, and again, they don't force their way in. You know, they say, we're lost, can we use the phone? Or we're homeless, have you got some food? Or can we come in and use the phone to phone our parents? And people get such a creepy vibe from the black-eyed kids that for the most part they don't let them in because they just look so weird. And dogs and cats respond in a very kind of negative way to the presence of the black-eyed children. They freak out, and there's stories of them sort of running off and hiding under the bed, or just quaking and shaking in the corner of the room, as if the dogs can actually pick up on something that shows them that they're not normal people. So, you know, you could make a case that because the black-eyed children phenomenon is suddenly growing and growing, there's so much on the internet about it, they could be kind of like a thought form tulpa that's gathering more and more strength as more and more people come to believe in it. And that is one of the things that Ray's group was warning people about. The more, as they saw it, the more that you believe in these things or read about it or learn about it and it's in your mind, the more you strengthen it and the more it becomes real. But of course the problem is, you know, our brains work in certain ways. It's like if I say to you, I want everybody in the room not to think about the purple banana. What's the first thing that comes to mind? It's the purple banana. It's like, how do you stop yourself from thinking about something? And that was one of the big concerns the group had. If these demonic entities, to a degree, can get their grips into us more and more deeply by us believing them, how do you turn people off and away from believing them or not thinking about them? And so that was kind of in sort of like an abbreviated fashion. That's the history of the group. They came to believe that the UFO phenomenon is demonic, supernatural, occult, paranormal, and they felt it was their job, and maybe they still do. As I said, I don't truthfully know if they still are active in the sense of still doing work. But certainly they were looking at the idea of trying to find a way to lessen the effects of the occult in the real world. Now, as Ray pointed out himself, he did not know if this was some vast kind of disinformation program to actually turn people away from the idea that it really was extraterrestrials. As I say, I don't have a firm opinion on any of all of this. All I can do is sort of share with you what Ray Boucher was told by the guys in the Pentagon, and share the data with you that they told him, which, you know, I can relate to you. So it is sort of a disturbing and dark story. To what extent it's the truth, I honestly don't know. It wouldn't surprise me. I mean, I fully believe Ray. I don't think Ray was not lying at all. He told the story as he was told by the guys from the Pentagon. Were the guys from the Pentagon speaking truthfully? That's something we'll never know unless, you know, the full story comes out. But what I would say, even though some people said, oh, this has got to be disinformation, the fact is you can go back and find how the occult and people in the occult world did cross over into the world of the military and the intelligence world, like, for example, Jack Parsons, who had a top secret clearance with the US military, and, you know, was involved with Aleister Crowley. Aleister Crowley, in the Second World War, was hired by British intelligence to try and find out if supernatural means could have been used to try and defeat the Nazis. So, you know, we're not just relying on something that occurred in the 1990s or the 80s. It went back years and years. So that leads me to believe that the group was doing all this. But the big question, of course, is even if they're not extraterrestrial, and even if they're manipulative and dangerous, does that mean we know for sure that they're literal demons from a literal hell? No, it doesn't. It means we're dealing with something that we don't understand, and that may be dangerous at times, may be manipulative, and may be, you know, physically dangerous to us, but not necessarily always. So I think my perspective is more that we probably are dealing with a phenomenon that isn't extraterrestrial. I kind of take more of a multi-dimensional approach to it. And I think there are certain aspects of the phenomenon which we should caution people about. But does that mean, you know, they are coming from a literal hell overseen by this guy with a, you know, a forked tail and horns? You know, for me, I can't take that leap. And I think it would be irresponsible for me to say I do think it's that. I would sort of, you know, encourage people, if they're interested in it, to sort of look further into the story, because there's much more to it, and look at it from the perspective, just be open-minded on it, because a lot of people who read the book particularly got quite freaked out by some of the concepts they had, and to the point where, you know, they see sleepless nights. And if it's true, well, you can understand why that would be, but if it's also disinformation, well, then it's working really well. So, you know, that is essentially the story as it was related to me. If anybody's got any questions, observations or thoughts, you know, we can chat about that. Yes. Thank you. The question was, what do I think about Bigfoot? Well, my other big interest beyond UFOs is cryptozoology. And cryptozoology is the study of unknown animals, like the Loch Ness Monster, Bigfoot, Abominable Snowman, Chupacabra, Mothman, things like that. My view on Bigfoot is that if Bigfoot was just, well, but people say Bigfoot, you know, it kind of sounds like there's this one creature crazily running around all the United States, you know, which obviously isn't the case. If they're flesh and blood animals, and because sightings have gone on for hundreds of years, right back into Native American legends going back a long time, if they were just unknown animals, I think we would have caught one by now. Because, you know, if they're just the equivalent of African gorillas, but something bigger and slightly more human-like, I think the odds that we wouldn't have at least one body or captured one is so stupid, it's not even worth thinking about, because yeah, most people never see a mountain lion in the wild, most people never see a bear in the wild, but people do see bears in the wild, and people do see mountain lions in the wild, and we do have them in zoos, etc., and they get tagged, you know, they put a little tracking device in them and let them go, things like that. These Bigfoot creatures, you know, there's probably thousands of them, there have to be to have a healthy colony, and they're sort of 7 to 8 feet tall, and in a country as technologically advanced as the US, we can't even catch one. You know, they never get hit by cars, they never get shot. No animal on the face of the planet is as lucky as Bigfoot, you know. And so I think we're dealing with something paranormal, because there are a lot of cases where people have said they've seen Bigfoot and they've vanished in a flash of light, or they've just literally faded away. There have been cases where people have seen Bigfoot in the woods and it's surrounded by weird balls of light. People claim to have had sort of telepathic conversations or words from them. So my view is that there is a Bigfoot phenomenon, but I don't believe it's like an equivalent, like I said, of a gorilla or an orangutan or anything like that. I think it's something that could be multi-dimensional, that flips in and out of our reality and then goes back to its own reality. I mean, things like quantum physics today are allowing for the existence of multiple dimensions. In a very simple way, the best way to describe it is, you know, you're driving down the highway in the car, the radio's on, you don't like the song, so you flip to another station, you don't like that one, you flip to another. All these stations are all playing music at the same time, but you can only be tuned into one at any given time. And that's kind of, in a very simple way, that the sort of principles of quantum physics, the idea that there can be multiple dimensions all going on, but unless you know how to jump from one to the other, we're constantly stuck in our one dimension until occasionally weird things happen and you know, people see things temporarily in our reality. So yeah, I do think the Bigfoots are real, but you know, if they were just apes, we would know.
Something similar to what you talk about, I heard of like, let's say, some kind of connection between technological advances in general, like not necessarily military stuff, and NAT type sources and like one example I heard about, somebody reported on a guy who started Xerox. He got inspired by that. Paranormal sources.
Oh, well, yeah, there are quite a few stories like that. In fact, me and Greg were talking about this, the idea, some scientists have felt they were inspired by something out there, to help them with their work. I mean, a perfect example, Nikola Tesla, brilliant scientist, who, created all sorts of weird technologies. And if his work had been allowed to continue and his files weren't confiscated and he didn't die, our technology today might be much better than it actually is. We wouldn't be reliant on fossil fuels and everything else. But he, there are a lot of stories about him allegedly being contacted by extraterrestrials or some sort of higher entities. There's actually quite a few stories like that where people felt something had spontaneously contacted them and it kind of helped them with their work. There actually is what's that book that's coming out, Greg?
I can't remember the name of it, but it's by Diana Walsh Pasolka. It's coming out next year.
And it's a book all about...
ASULK.
Yeah, it's a book, correct me if I'm wrong, it's a book all about scientists who felt inspired or they had some sort of weird interaction with extraterrestrials.
That's part of it.
Yeah.
I think you helped co-write a book or assisted with a book called Alien Viruses with Project Redfern. How would you like that to NAT?
Yeah, the question was a book that I worked on with a guy named Dr. Bob Wood. He wrote a book called Alien Viruses, and I did a lot of the research for him and sort of proofread it and corrected all the grammar, but it's basically Bob's book. And he has this interest in the idea of alien viruses and how they might affect us. Whether aliens might deliberately release viruses against which we didn't have any defense. Our bodies, our immune systems are designed to fight off terrestrial, Earth-based viruses. But sometimes, a virus will come along that our immune system just doesn't fight off too well, like Ebola, for example. That's sort of highly dangerous. A lot of people don't realise. Again, I'm kind of making the Walking Dead analogies. Ebola, a lot of controversy about how that began. A lot of people don't know that when a person dies of Ebola, you have to stay away from them for like 72 hours because infection can still set in. So in a skewed, odd way, that is kind of like, the Walking Dead come to life. The idea of a person dying from Ebola, and you have to stay away from them because the infection can still set in, even though they're dead. So, in other words, there are a lot of weird viruses out there that, it takes a long time to find a cure for them. You look at something like HIV, when that first came out, it was a death sentence. Today, with heavy cocktails of drugs and whatever, the person can pretty much live a normal lifespan. But there are a lot of stories about sort of spontaneous outbreaks of disease over the centuries, and some people have talked about sort of meteorites and comets coming near to the Earth and releasing spores of alien viruses that possibly could get into the population and which could decimate us. If you look, just Google Spanish flu in 1918, 1919. I think somewhere in the region of 30 million people died in that period around the world from Spanish flu. 30 million, most people forgot about it and didn't even know. Today, 30 million people dying, from a virus or something like that in major news, everywhere. So there's no doubt that the theoretical idea of alien viruses could be very dangerous to us. Now, in terms of what you asked about whether or not this could tie in with the NHEs, I don't have any proof of that, but what I would say, there are a lot of cases, like with Albert Bender, where people were in proximity to things like the Men in Black, and they did fall sick. And I've got quite a few cases where people fell sick after encountered the Men in Black, and they were like really weird diseases. It wasn't like then, you know, a cold or the flu or whatever. It was just obscure things that took time to cure. Whether that was a deliberate attempt, you know, to infect the person, or it was some sort of byproduct of some sort of energy they're giving off, I don't know. But I mean, you know, you could actually make that case if the person was sort of supernaturally infected.
Does the Collins elite still exist?
Yeah.
Who's Collins?
Well, throughout the lecture, I was sort of referred to it as the group. They gave me what they admitted was a nickname of the Collins elite, and I said, "Well, is that the name?" And they said, "Well, that's, if you want to talk to us, we'll use that." And as a means of identification. And they said they've used that as a means of identification with other people before. And I think, although they didn't specifically state this, my conclusion is I think there's a classified name for it, which they didn't want to release. And I think they used the Collins elite, which was a legitimate nickname they used. But the reason they used it is because when the group was established, one of the first people they brought on board who was outside of the group, who was a member of the public, was somebody who lived in a New York town, little town called Collins. And it was just kind of like a jokey term because everybody else in the program was working with the government or the intelligence community. And this guy just had a background in religion, and they consulted with him. And so he was kind of, in their jokey sense, he was the elite member of the group because he wasn't part of the government. And he came from Collins, so they called it Collins elite. Which, you know, if it was just disinformation, I don't think they would have picked out such a bizarre, roundabout way of coming up with a strange name. I mean, why even invent a nickname in the first place? They could have just said, "We don't want to tell you the name of the program." So things like that is what leads me to believe the story's true. But there's a lot of it, I'm sure, which still hasn't surfaced and probably won't for years and years. The question was about Mothman. Mothman was this creature seen in Point Pleasant, West Virginia from late '66 to December '67. It was described like a winged humanoid kind of thing with his blood red glowing eyes, and it's sort of crossed between a bat and a gargoyle and a person. And sightings were made, as I said, all around town, and all culminated in December '67 when the town's Silver Bridge collapsed into the Ohio River and killed, I think it was 46 people. And researchers have suggested either the Mothman caused the disaster, or that more people today don't believe it was like a warning kind of entity that surfaces when disasters are about to happen. Now, as you said, there was a wave of sightings in Chicago just recently of a creature that looked like the Mothman, and so people are now wondering, does that mean there's going to be some sort of disaster in Chicago? I haven't seen any evidence that that's going to happen, but there are people who are talking about that and are now keeping their eyes open for anything else that might happen. But I mean, I always tell people, you know, maybe don't get too sucked into seeing things that might happen that actually haven't happened and become obsessed with it, because sometimes that does happen where people become obsessed with things like the occult and supernatural. And, you know, it's like anything in life, it's never good to be overly obsessive about anything. But I think, you know, sometimes these events, that does happen. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting that there's new wave of sightings and new reports. Whether it's going to mean anything, you know, I have no idea. Anybody else? Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, what was that last one? Oh yeah, well that's actually a good question. Did anybody try and, after the Pentagon was doing this work, did anybody try and close the door and send these things back? Yeah, what actually happened was that the more I dug into it, the more I found there were sort of sub-projects of the overall project. And they weren't all in line with each other as to what should be done. There were some of them who actually wanted to, as I said earlier, weaponize the technology or the powers of these NHEs. Others felt what they needed to do was stay away from them as far as possible, but to try and subtly inform the general public of what they felt was really going on and warn them to stay away from the subject. So in other words, some people wanted to weaponize it and work with them. Other people said, no, we know they exist, we don't need to be invoking them, we don't need to bring them through, we just need to tell people and inform them how to keep them at bay. And apparently there was quite a debate where they may actually have splintered into two different groups, one that is on the warning side and the other one trying to do a deal, you know, to get whatever they can out of it. But, again, like I said, it sounds like the wildest sci-fi, but when you look into it, you actually find this really is going on. So, but again, the only downside is that, you know, it's kind of, if somebody wants to write a book on the CIA, on the history of the CIA, and they've just got 6 or 7 people to interview, and that's it. They're only going to get to see a small portion of the entire agency and what it does. And that's kind of the situation I was in. That, although I know at times there were 25, 30, 40 people, I only got to speak to sort of 4 or 5. So I truthfully don't know how many other sub-projects there could have been, what they're up to today. Only for sure what was going on in the 90s through the early 2000s, and then with Parsons and Crowley. So there clearly was a lot more going on. And maybe in the same way that I was approached, Ray O'Shea was, Linda Howe was, maybe somebody else will be approached, or already has been, and they might be able to, you know, fill in some of the gaps that we're looking for as well. So I don't think it's the end of the story, but it'd be interesting to see where it all leads. All right, thanks a lot.